Hi everybody, and welcome back to the very last online lecture that, God willing, hopefully, you'll have to listen to this semester from me. We are going to finish up our discussion of social development in the preschool period, and that means talking a lot about parenting and then a little bit about peer relationships. And as we talk about parenting, I want to say that, of course, parenting is relevant not just during the preschool period, it's relevant from one. What makes it of particular interest during the preschool period is that, especially as kids are kind of transitioning, really into toddlerhood and then to the preschool period, they're starting to make their own decisions and contradict parents sometimes. And so really issues of discipline, as the child is kind of a year and a half, 2 years of age and further, start to really become important. In addition, during the preschool period, especially the early preschool years, 2, 3 years of age, you still have a child who doesn't have, a mature level of self-control, doesn't necessarily have mature logic in place, and so sometimes parenting can be a real challenge in terms of discipline. So I want to talk with you a little bit about parenting with an emphasis on discipline, and then we'll talk a little bit about peer relationships. So we're going to start off our discussion of parenting by talking about Diana Baumrein's model of parenting, her styles of parenting. And as you can see there on the slide, what she has done based on all of her research, which kind of started in the 1960s and kind of reached its peak for her personally in the 70s and 80s, but many people have studied parenting using this model. What you can see there, is she organizes styles of parenting on two dimensions. Basically, whether or not, or the degree to which, I should say, a parent is responsive or warm or communicative with the child. That runs up the vertical axis there. And then the other dimension is how demanding a parent is. Other ways of thinking about this include, how mature of behavior does the parenting demand or require? Does the parent have standards for the child in terms of their behavior? Okay, so that runs across the vertical axis there. So the two axes are really kind of like warmth, love, responsiveness, and also the other axis being kind of demandingness or expectations for the child's behavior. Okay, and obviously these two dimensions are really each a continuum, right? I mean, it's not simply black and white, are you responsive or not? I mean, parents are all over the place. Good day, you might be super responsive. Not so great day, you might only be kind of average responsive. Bad day, you might be super not responsive. But for the sake of simplicity here, we've taken what is really a continuum and just divided it into kind of these black and white categories. So let's take a look at these different categories, and then we'll move on to talk a little bit about why they're important. Okay, and be sure as you're learning these that you distinguish clearly between those two that look very similar, authoritative and authoritarian. Let's address authoritative first. Okay, the authoritative parent is one who is responsive, so they're warm and loving and empathetic towards their child, but they also expect a lot. They expect mature behavior, especially when you're out in public and you might annoy other people. They expect decent grades when a child gets into school. Okay, they expect rooms to be clean, table manners to be present, and they're willing to discipline when those expectations are violated, all the while still remaining responsive and caring towards their child. Okay, so in a disciplinary situation, let's set up a case, if you will, a case study, and we can see how each of these parents might respond in the case study. Let's say you're a parent and you've got a 4-year-old, we'll call her Carrie, and a little baby named Max, okay? And you're in the kitchen, maybe unpacking groceries. Max is in his maybe car seat or something. You still haven't unpacked Max from the trip to the store. And Carrie is just, with him, maybe in the living room. So you're in the kitchen, the kids are in the living room, and all of a sudden Max completely cries bloody murder. And you walk into the living room just in time to see Carrie dropping Max's hand from her own hand And as you approach, you see teeth marks in Max's hand, and it's pretty clear that Carrie has bitten Max. The authoritative parent, in this case, would maintain warmth and responsiveness towards both kids, but they also are going to hold Carrie to account. So, you might hear the authoritative parent say something like, Carrie, I know sometimes Max gets on your nerves. There's that kind of empathetic part, right? But it's not okay to bite. And since you've bitten him, you need to take a 5-minute timeout or something like that. So they follow through on some kind of punishment for the child. They might also hear Carrie's side of the story. Again, that responsiveness part. Did Max do something to upset you? Heck, Max might have poked her in the eye accidentally. Nonetheless, they still hold that standard that Carrie can't bite Max. Okay? Let's move on to the authoritarian parent and see how that would differ. An authoritarian parent, or a parent acting in an authoritarian manner, is not warm or responsive to their child, but they have a lot of expectations about behavior. Sometimes those expectations are even too high, right? They may exceed the capacity of the child. So in this case, with Max and Carrie, mom or dad may have come into the living room and, maybe just started screaming at Carrie. What are you doing? You know you shouldn't bite Max. You are grounded for a week. Often the punishment kind of exceeds the seriousness of the crime, if you will. So lots of yelling. Authoritarian parents are more likely to use physical punishment, such as spanking. And we will talk about spanking in a little bit. Other parents use it too, not just authoritarian parents. But, when in the extreme, an authoritarian approach really almost becomes abusive. Okay? Moving over to the last column, the permissive parent, sometimes called indulgent parenting, is one who is warm and responsive to the child, but doesn't really expect much or follow through on any kind of discipline. So, in some ways, the permissive parent or the indulgent parent is kind of like the child's best buddy, if you will, but they don't take the authority that really is invested in them as parents. So in our situation with Carrie and Max, a parent who is permissive might walk in, they might make some kind of, weak statement of discipline. Oh, Carrie, you really shouldn't be biting your brother, but I know it's hard to be a big sister, isn't it? And of course, they'd attend to Max, as would a parent probably in all of these categories. But there would really be no discipline for Carrie in this case. But there'd still be a lot of warmth and love on the part of the parent. And then finally, the uninvolved parent, as the name suggests, kind of doesn't care. Right? I mean, they're not very responsive to the child. They don't expect much from the child. They might make a weak attempt at some kind of discipline. Carrie, stop bugging your brother. Maybe they yell that from the kitchen, but that's really about it. Okay. So there's not a lot of warmth in that relationship, nor are there expectations. And again, in the extreme, the uninvolved parent is really quite a neglectful parent. Okay. So let's move on, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of children who are parented by each of these types of parents. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the research on parenting styles. And there's 2 points I'd like to hit. One is the evidence on what kind of kids shall we say, come out of a situation where parenting is either authoritative or authoritarian or what have you. And then talk briefly about cultural differences as well. We have mountains of research on parenting styles. Most of it is correlational in terms of what kind of parenting is linked with what kinds of outcomes for kids. And correlational research can't definitively tell us about cause and effect. So by saying that, I want to say that most of the research, although it's suggestive of perhaps a certain parenting style leading to a certain outcome for kids, it doesn't slam dunk prove that the parenting causes a particular outcome. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. That being said, these reams and mountains of research do suggest that, not surprisingly, authoritative parenting, where a parent is warm and loving and responsive to their child, but also is willing to discipline and willing to take that parental authority, best predicts best outcomes for kids. So whether you're talking higher levels of self-esteem or better academic achievement or healthier peer relationships, time and time again, the authoritative parenting approach predicts those outcomes, whereas we'll see in a video clip the other forms of parenting predict problems for the child. Okay, so why don't you take a moment and actually click on the link to the video and just listen to this gentleman's review of the research on the different parenting styles, and then we'll come back and talk about cultural differences and some other issues as well. Take a look at the video. One of the reasons I like that video is that the guy is pretty humble. Right at the beginning he says, I've committed all of these, parenting sins myself, if you will. And that's really true. I mean, we're talking about parents as if they're being placed in boxes and are always permissive or always uninvolved. Or always authoritative. Of course, parents have their good days and their bad days. When we talk about an authoritative parent, we are talking about a parent who day in and day out tends to be authoritative. But on any given day and in any given situation, any given parent can be, all over the place. So we're talking about trends in parenting. And for that reason, by the way, I think it's really important not to judge parents. You might see a parent in a grocery store absolutely lose it with a kid, and oh man, that parent, they're so authoritarian, that kid's going to have an awful life. Well, it may just be an off day for the parent. We all have those. I do want to briefly address cultural differences, again, kind of with the lesson that we shouldn't judge. We do find some minor cultural differences in the outcomes connected with these parenting styles, and what it suggests is that in some cultures you will find a slightly more authoritarian style, not totally authoritarian, okay? It's not like they're, abusive towards their kids, but someone who is more willing to, maybe yell at their kids, maybe shame their kids a little bit more, without necessarily having the negative correlations that we find in our kind of white middle class society in the United States. Some of the cultures that seem to be a bit more authoritarian without necessarily having a negative impact are poverty-stricken cultures within the United States. Some ethnic groups, such as African Americans, lean a little bit more authoritarian than you might find among your average white middle-class person. And that actually, in some research, seems that it might be kind of helpful in terms of protecting kids from some of the dangers that may face them, especially if they're growing up like in the inner city. Far Eastern cultures, Chinese cultures and so forth, tend to be a bit more authoritarian with their kids. And yet a little bit more authoritarianism doesn't seem to necessarily have a negative impact. But I want to make it clear that we're not talking about a parent completely shifting towards total authoritarianism. Okay, it's just that, being a little bit more authoritarian than our mainstream culture in the United States would be maybe comfortable with. Okay, so there are some cultural differences. Let's move on, and we're going to talk a little bit about the issue of spanking. All right, so as we mentioned, families that are a little bit more authoritarian in nature do tend to use physical punishment more, spanking more. But that being said, you can actually find instances of spanking with all kinds of parents. It's kind of a question of how it's done, if you will. This is one point where I'm kind of sad that we're not in class together. Maybe we can take this up next week or on the 17th, depending on when you're listening to this. That might be next week or it might not be when we meet again. And that's, what about spanking? You hear a lot, if you listen to the radio or read the media or whatever, you hear a lot of negative reports about spanking with, some measure of accuracy, I will say. That being said, I'm guessing that if we were in class, if you are like most other child development sections I've taught over the past 20 years, if I were to ask you how many of you were spanked as children, a good number of you would raise your hands, and yet you're not out, committing mass murder or anything. So it's clearly kind of a subtle question with many different facets. And so I would ask you to think about the questions that I've listed here for discussion. One is, do you believe spanking is appropriate? Why or why not? And, that's something to be thinking about even now, and that's something that you and a potential partner would probably want to be on the same page about. And then the second question, does Christianity have any contribution to make to this discussion? And if so, what? You can find places in the Bible that seem to endorse physical punishment. Probably the most well-known one is spare the rod and spoil the child. Although some thinkers, some writers within the Christian tradition have argued that you need to understand that verse in particular, at least, from the perspective of what a rod means in the context of the Old Testament. And usually it was linked with shepherding sheep. And it was an instrument that shepherds had. And you can kind of imagine a shepherd didn't necessarily use the rod to go around and beat his sheep, but instead used it to kind of guide them, right? Kind of tap them on the midsection to get them to go in one direction or another. Anyway, so, you can find different perspectives within the Christian tradition. By the time we get to the end of our discussion of spanking, I'll share a little bit about mine. But we'll get there eventually. All right. So as we turn to the social science or psychological research on spanking, we have to admit as psychologists that this is a really tough area to study, as have many of the other areas we've looked at, right? Like infant daycare. The research is mostly correlational, just like I said, with the parenting research in general. And what that means is that we can't necessarily easily tell cause and effect. In order to do the kind of study where we could tell cause and effect, we would probably have to break ethical guidelines in this case. I'd have to randomly assign, a group of families to one group and tell that group, you have to only spank your child. That's the only kind of discipline you can do. And then I'd have to randomly assign other families to a different group and prohibit them from spanking. And telling families what to do as disciplinary procedures is really outside the realm of what psychologists should be doing in their research. So we have to rely on non-optimal studies, and that means that we can't necessarily make firm cause and effect statements. Okay. In addition, historically, studies, I guess, are getting better about controlling for this, but historically, many studies have not really controlled very well their definition of spanking. So they've, included families where, the parents spank, but they spank, so hard and so frequently that actually they're really kind of abusive. And to study spanking as it's used in many families, you'd have to weed that out. Even our Department of Child and Family Services will tell you, right, that's the department, the state department that's protects children, basically, tries to at least. Sorry, little commentary there. They will tell you that, the act of spanking isn't inherently abusive, right? And so researchers really need to be very careful to weed out those families that are being abusive. And they haven't always done that, which, of course, leads to questions about, the validity of the research. More recent study has done that, but if you go back a couple decades ago, they weren't always as clear about that as they should have been. All right, so let's take a look, despite all the problems, at what the research says. All right, so let's turn our attention then to some of this research. In your textbook, you find what you often hear psychologists saying, okay, that spanking is related to ultimately negative outcomes. You might get obedience in the short run, but in the long run, you find kids who have been spanked, demonstrating more aggressive behavior, feeling unloved, having a higher incidence of psychological problems, and so forth. There is research that suggests that, so I'm not going to say that your textbook author is wrong. I just think that, probably there are other perspectives that need to be included, other perspectives from the academic community. So what I'm going to try and do here with the last couple of bullet points is share some of those perspectives as we talk about this. Okay? And with, respect to Laura Burke, I mean, stuff has come out, especially the latter point you'll see here, Ferguson's paper, has come out since she wrote the edition of the book that most of you have. So it'll be interesting to see what she says in her next edition. Anyway, so over the last 10 years or so, there's been a couple of studies that have come out, really major studies that I think have been important in helping us think about the effects or possible effects of spanking. The first one that I think is important was published in 2005 by Dr. Lars O'Leary at Oklahoma State, and his co-writer Kuhn. And they were really kind of the first to weed out the studies from earlier on that really didn't control for abusive families in their samples. All right, so they collected all the studies they could find. If the study did not clearly exclude people who were abusive, they put those studies back on the shelf. And then they only reviewed those studies where the parents engaged in which they called conditional spanking. Okay, let's define what conditional spanking means. Okay, it's very limited spanking is basically what it comes down to. So first of all, it's using spanking only occasionally, so it's not like your main, first go-to attempt at disciplining your child. So it's not used very often. It's not used when angry. Okay. It is used only with a hand. Okay, and let's think about that, because actually that's an important point, I think, because it actually contradicts some of the Christian literature that's out there, literature written by Christian psychologists. Lars O'Leary and Kuhn say that conditional spanking involves only using a hand and not using a belt, not using a wooden spoon, not using a paddle. Well, why would that be important? And whoever thought that physics would be relevant to child development, but here it is. When you extend the length of your arm by holding something in your hand, you actually increase the velocity and the force with which you are hitting a child. All right, so if you add another foot to your hand because you got a big wooden spoon in your hand, you're hitting them harder than you would if you were just using your hand. Not only are you hitting them harder, but you're hitting them with something that's not going to give you personally sensory feedback about how hard you're hitting them, right? I mean, you're not going to feel anything if you hit them with a wooden spoon, right? If you spank with a wooden spoon. But if you spank with your hand, you have some feedback, some, sensory, perceptual feedback about how hard you're hitting. Okay, so Lars O'Leary, weeded out studies that did not control for that type of thing. And when they selected only studies that involved conditional spanking, so spanking rarely, not spanking in anger, and not using an inanimate object to spank, but spanking only with hands, they found that there was really no relationship, no correlation to any kind of negative outcome. And I think that's important because probably many of you came from families where that kind of spanking happened. And not surprisingly, most of you are turning out okay, right? Just as an aside, it is actually Dr. James Dobson. Some of you may have heard of. He writes, or in the past has written quite a bit for the Christian community, who recommended actually using some kind of object when you spank. And his argument was actually more along the line of classical conditioning, that you don't want the child to associate your hand with pain, and therefore you should use something else to spank the child with. With all due respect to Dr. Dobson, I disagree. I'm more a Larzalarian here, I guess. First of all, I think that kids are, well, forgive the crassness, but not that stupid. They realize that it's your hand holding the object and therefore are going to associate, you with the pain. Secondly, I think Dr. Dobson, overlooked the physics, basically, of what it means to have some other object in your hand. So I would definitely, if you feel you need to spank, I would definitely advocate not using some other object aside from your hand. Okay, so that's Larry and Kuhn's work. I think pretty important work that gives an alternative perspective to what you often hear in the psychological literature. Ferguson came out just recently, a couple years ago, with a really major paper as well, and looking at what we call longitudinal data, over time, basically. When the kids are very young, we might measure whether they have been spanked or not, and then come back a couple years later and start measuring other things like their behavior, their intelligence, and things like that. And he did find that in this very major study, over studies, spanking does actually slightly predict some problems, behavior problems, emotional problems, and even issues related to intelligence. But I want to emphasize the word slightly. Okay, I mean, the correlation, for those of you who know what correlations are, was like plus 0.10 or something like that. You don't need to know that for the test. If that made no sense, don't worry about it. Okay, but it was a significant correlation, but it was very small. So the degree to which this is really meaningful in real life is kind of in question. Okay, so I think the picture that this adds up to is that from a psychological perspective, a certain type of very limited spanking is probably not going to produce monsters. Okay, a very, very limited form of spanking, conditional spanking. There's no evidence, at least we can say at this point, that necessarily has super negative outcomes. Okay, that's from a psychological perspective. Now, I told you I would let you know kind of where I stand about spanking. I believe that parents can, I give them freedom, of course, to make their own decisions. That being said, I guess I'm not a huge fan of spanking. Okay, in part, because there are studies such as Ferguson's, which did, by the way, make sure that there were no abusive parents in it. That says that you are upping the risk just a little bit if you engage in spanking. That's one issue, kind of from a psychological perspective, but also more just kind of from a philosophical perspective. I think a disciplinary situation is a chance to teach a child about problem solving. Okay, and what do you do when you want something but you're not supposed to take it, etc. What do you do when you have one perspective on the situation but your dad has another perspective? And really nowhere else in life would we allow hitting to be part of the problem solving process. So I just think, really maybe in terms of modeling, I guess you might say, but also philosophically, I just don't think it makes sense. Okay, maybe if we were a super violent society and what have you, that it might make a little more sense, but I don't see it making much sense. That being said, I think some of the best research suggests that if parents use very limited spanking, they're not going to ruin their kids, as long as that happens in a loving, warm, authoritative context. That, by the way, was another aspect of conditional spanking, that in general, the parents had a very warm, loving relationship with their kids. Okay. So, as is the case with so many things this semester, I think of infant daycare, for example, there's not a lot of super clear answers, okay, on the issue of spanking. I've shared with you my perspective. Obviously, you have the right to make your own perspective or to develop your own perspective as long as you are not being abusive. let's move on to a very brief discussion of peer relationships. Okay, on our last slide here, we're going to talk just very briefly about some characteristics of preschool peer relationships. As kids get out into the wider world and get curious about the wider world, they often, strike up their first kind of self-chosen peer relationships. And I want to talk just briefly about them because in our next unit on middle childhood, we're going to focus on peer relationships when we get to talk about social development. And I want you to be able to kind of compare how those relationships have changed between the preschool period and the middle childhood period. All right, so just a couple of notes here. In comparison to peer relationships, friendships of older kids and adults, we find preschoolers emphasizing shared activity more than they will later. So if you ask a preschooler, why is so-and-so your friend? Often you will get an answer because we like to play dolls together, or, we both play t-ball together. So instead of defining the friendship based on shared values or what have you, the activity is quite crucial. And, given how kind of concrete preschoolers are, that probably makes sense. Their cognitive skills have not developed to the place where they can start to conceive of, internal values and how my personality complements her personality. And that's a little too abstract probably for most preschoolers. They also tend to be, as we've talked about, fairly egocentric, especially early on in preschool, and so it's not surprising that they're a little bit more focused on fulfilling their own wishes than the other person's wishes. So, if Joey is my friend because we play Transformers together, and Joey decides that he doesn't want to play Transformers anymore, but I really do, that relationship may fall apart. So if that other person isn't kind of providing what I need or what I'm interested in, then the friendship is kind of over, at least more often than it would be later on. Okay. Again, it's not to, these are relative differences. So preschoolers are more likely to focus on fulfilling their own wishes. It doesn't mean they always do, and those of us who are older never do. It's more on a continuum. Okay. But again, given the relatively egocentric nature of young preschoolers, especially before, age 4 or so, that makes a little bit of sense. And then finally, the third item, probably in large part because of the first two items, preschool friendships are relatively unstable. What that means is, if you ask a child who their best friend is at the beginning of the school year in September, and then you come back at Christmas, you may well get a different answer when you ask who the best friend is at Christmas. That's not so much the case when kids get into elementary school and beyond. Perhaps because those later friendships are based on more substantive things like values and, caring for one another and so forth. They tend to be a bit more stable. All right, so that's just a very brief introduction to peer relationships, and we'll pick up that topic a little bit more in our next unit. All right, see you in class on the 17th. Bye-bye.